course, I'm Kevin May. I'm the editor-in-chief of Phocuswright, and I'm delighted to introduce Madeline List. She's a research analyst at Phocuswright, which is our sister brand from Phocuswright. Madeline, a very good day to you. We're looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. I will pass the baton over to you.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Very happy to be here today. So as we well know, the cases of COVID-19 have really been increasing quite drastically and ballooning since they first surfaced in China at the end of last year. I, right here, have outlined some of the key events that happened that have influenced the markets who we spoke to within this survey. On March 11th, the WHO declared that COVID-19 had reached pandemic status. And in the days following, the US declared a state of national emergency. The UK and France followed suit. And then several states in Germany followed with declarations of emergency as well. Now, all of the travel restrictions and the containment measures that were imposed in order to control and mitigate the COVID-19 situation have effectively really ground a lot of leisure travel to a halt. So we went and we surveyed people in each of these markets, US, UK, France, and Germany, who have upcoming leisure travel between the time that this survey was fielded, which was the end of March in 2020, and June 30th of 2020. And we wanted to find out how their plans were changing, if at all, and what factors they were going to consider in order to feel better about traveling again in the future. Now, we surveyed 400 people in each of these markets, and the survey included samples of people who were traveling both domestically and internationally. They were using various forms of transit like air, rail, car rental, cruise, etc. And they were also using both paid lodging or non-paid lodging options. Now, when it comes to the way that COVID-19 was impacting travelers' plans, it's very easy to assume that these are people who want to be out, they want to be exploring. We're speaking with people within the sample who have already made bookings. Many have already put down money. They have plans that they were looking forward to coming up. And so we wanted to know that when they had to make changes, that when restrictions were imposed, what is their attitude going into this situation, understanding that governments have really put down a lot of measures that restricted their ability to carry on with their travel plans as they wanted to. And the answer is that people are going into this with a very accepting mindset. We see that in our markets, between 44 to 50% of people surveyed feel that the restrictions that the government has put down in regards to travel are really just right. And there's even an additional about a third of people per market who feel that they would be comfortable with even stronger travel restrictions being put in place. So even though this is a sample of people who love to be out, they love to be exploring, and they love to be exploring in unrestricted ways, the changes that they are making to their plans are coming from a place of understanding and not a place of resentment or frustration. When it comes to the ways that their trips were actually affected, the number one way that trips were affected in the US, UK, and France was that trips were being postponed. After that, the next most common was for trips to be canceled. In Germany, it was the reverse. People were actually opting for cancellation more often than they were opting to postpone. And then in each of these markets, there are additional subsets of people who tried to do different things with their soonest upcoming leisure trip. There were some people who want to roll the dice and take the trip as planned without making any changes at all. And then there were also a subset who wanted to make changes to their trip to adapt it to the COVID situation. So they may have switched their destination, they may have opted for another form of transit, another type of accommodation, or something else that would help them be more shielded and protected from any of the risks of traveling during COVID. But when it comes to what to do with the soonest upcoming trip, age does make a difference. And this depends on the market as well. In the US, many younger people felt that COVID-19 was a bigger threat to older generations. The younger travelers were more willing than others to take the chance that they would be able to travel as planned without making any adjustments to the timing or the way that they would carry out their trip. In the UK, pushing trips into the future was the most preferred course of action across all age groups, but people who were 55 and older practiced more caution here and were more likely to postpone and cancel their trips than other age groups overall. Germany was an interesting situation because travelers approached this with a more egalitarian approach across age verticals. They were similarly likely to either cancel or postpone across age groups. And then there were also a higher percentage of people in Germany across all age groups who were still undecided about their options. So we had about 22 to 23% of people across the age verticals who were watching the news, who were dragging their feet a bit and waiting for more information to come in and more time to pass before they make a final decision on what they're going to do with these soonest upcoming trips. And then in France, these travelers exhibited the most optimism that they would be able to take their trips at a later date. When it comes to people who were postponing, there is a fair amount of optimism that people would be able to travel within the upcoming 1 to 6 months after their intended travel date. In the UK, they were a bit more cautious about this as well. There were a higher percentage of travelers who were pushing their trip even further than 6 months, but we still had 48% of people who fell within this window of postponing by only 1 to 6 months. And then France is also an interesting outlier here, where we have nearly 3 in 4 people who postponed who feel confident that they can travel within that 1 to 6 month window, and they're expressing quite a fair bit of optimism that this is something that's going to be an option for them. But if people weren't able to postpone and they did choose to cancel, we also wanted to know what they were doing with that time that was going to be designated for travel. And the answer is that many people were forced to snap into a routine that was very much affected by the COVID-19 situation. Up to 68% of people had to go to a normal routine adjusted for coronavirus with that time that they had originally set aside to travel. Only 16% of people were able to continue with a normal routine. So this was something that was quite interruptive to the people who we surveyed. And then there were some people who were open to using that time and had plans to do a staycation in their home city, but this was really a minority in all markets. In the US, this was a bit more common. 22% of people who canceled intended to use that time for a staycation, but the numbers went down from there. And there's really 2 sides to looking at the data for this situation here. One is that these are people who were surveyed who were being more affected by the situation. They might not be able to go out and experience the attractions or the dining scene in their local cities because there may already be so many closures and restrictions because of COVID that this isn't an option. But the other side of this, and this is a theme that we're going to see pop up throughout other parts of this presentation as well, is that the people who have set aside this time to travel, they are maximizers. And if they designated that time to travel and to take a vacation and to have a leisurely trip, they want to get the most possible out of that time that's designated. And for many people, that means that they don't want to do it in their home city. They don't want to do it too close to home. They want to take that time and they want to be out exploring and enjoying the destination that they selected for themselves. That being said, there were many factors that were weighing on people's decisions to change their plans in any way. This includes postponements, cancellations, or changing the nature of their trip. And the 3 main concerns really fell into thematic buckets. One was that there was a risk of catching or spreading COVID, the natural health risks that became concerning for people when they had to sit down and decide what they were going to do with their upcoming trip. Another was that their mobility might not be as free as they had intended. They might not be able to move from place to place as freely as they normally would, and this was a major inhibitor for people who want to take the time and be exploring and be out and experiencing a new place as much as they want to. And then the last is that there was concern that they might not be able to fully enjoy a destination. Many people are paying quite a bit to transport themselves to a different location. They might be going somewhere very new, very exotic, and it's important to them that they can enjoy what the place has to offer. If this wasn't an option, they would want to take the trip at a time when they could truly absorb the full experience that their destination would have to offer them. Now, the health concerns in most markets were the considerations first and foremost that affected people's decisions to change their trips. In the US, we see that the fear of exposure to COVID-19 in transit or destination played especially strong roles, with 61 or 64% of travelers expressing this as a concern that made people change their trips. But in the UK and France, the fear of becoming sick somewhere along the trip were also the number one concerns that people expressed that made them change their plans. Now, fear of exposing others was a concern that came up, but it was secondary. It took a back seat to people's personal health. And first and foremost, they're looking out to make sure that they'll be healthy and that they'll be able to travel and return back without getting sick or risking their personal health or safety at all. Now, it would be it's tempting to assume even that the destination that somebody is going to have a really strong effect on whether they're worried about catching COVID. And while this can vary by individual region, we're seeing that the risk of getting COVID in an international versus a domestic destination is not a major inhibitor for people. And people don't feel that crossing a border or going to a foreign place, traveling abroad, is going to put them at higher risk for getting COVID than they would be in their home country. But what is really affecting people's fear of getting COVID in the travel process is air travel. And the travelers who do have an air component in their trips are expressing a much higher fear of getting infected in transit than those who are not traveling by air are. This is also particularly pronounced in the US, where 70% of people who would be traveling by air are concerned that they could get exposed to COVID in transit, and they're concerned enough that they are changing their trips because of this fear. Now, this is an opportunity for air travel providers to really hone in on this concern and make sure that they're delivering messaging that makes travelers feel more placated about this risk. When airlines are making practices to sanitize planes in different ways that are more aggressive and protect people more, when they are minimizing exposure that passengers would need to have with the in-flight crew or the airline staff, or when they're changing seating plans in order to make people more spaced out from fellow passengers and impose more social distancing within the flights. These are things that could make people feel better about embarking on air travel when they're prepared to, because this is really a very strong factor that's encouraging people to change their plans, and it's something that they would want to feel better about before traveling again. Now, restricted mobility is also a concern that came up quite frequently. People want to feel that when they arrive at a destination, they can move about as they please, they can see what they want to, that they have freedom to enjoy a place in the way that they want to without having government or law enforcement step in and impose restrictions on them. Now, while they're understanding, as we saw before, about why restrictions are necessary, the fear of being quarantined still is motivating in making people change their plans. In Germany, which is a country that has had very aggressive testing measures and a very supportive and comprehensive healthcare system to address COVID-19, people actually are more concerned about fear of being quarantined overall than they're concerned about getting sick throughout their journey. But in other markets as well, they're still citing this as a frequent concern that's making them want to change their plans. And that includes both being quarantined when they arrive at a destination and being quarantined after their return home. And then another side of this coin is that while they might have fear of being quarantined or restricted in that regard, they're also worried about not getting home safely. There have been travel restrictions being imposed quite rapidly, and the travel restrictions could even change from day to day in some of these markets very quickly. And there have also been a fair amount of changes to the flight schedules and the transportation options available. And the travelers are telling us that they're scared that they might be able to go to their destination, but they might not get home safely. And that fear is causing a fair number of people to change the trips until they would be able to not worry about getting stranded within their destination. And then the last big theme that we're seeing is that people really want to enjoy what a destination has to offer, whether that's the lodging options, the dining options, restaurants, bars. People really want to be able to take advantage of those things if they're taking themselves out to the new destination. And if they fear that they might not be able to enjoy that because of all the closures that are happening, they're willing to change the trip plans because of that. To a lesser extent, the attractions and activity closures are also having effect on that as well. People would feel that they would not be able to enjoy everything that they had planned if too many attractions and activities are closed. And we do have a fair group of people who are choosing to consider this when they decide that they don't want to take their trip as planned. Now, when they do decide that they need to make changes to a trip, that usually involves interacting with service providers in order to make these changes. And we know that there's been a massive influx of customer service needs from travelers who need to make changes, whether that's postponements or cancellations or any other types of changes. And while there has been quite a burden on travel providers to deal with this huge onslaught of calls and new customer needs, what we're seeing from people is that overall, they're really quite satisfied with the way that this is being handled. We have the majority across all markets, between 53 and 64% of people who had to change their plans, saying that they were highly satisfied with the way that this was handled. And this was magnified even more with travelers who were 55 or older. We know from other studies that we've done at Phocuswright that loyalty status tends to be higher with these travelers who are 55 and older, and also that they can have some higher brand loyalty that affects their perceptions of the brands and how they interacted with them. And these factors can really come into play with increasing overall satisfaction of the experience. In the US and UK in particular, we're seeing some huge numbers with people who are 55 and older, that about 3/4 of people in these markets find themselves highly satisfied with the way that their changes were handled. And many of these people in this age group across these markets had to change their trips at a higher rate than their younger counterparts as well. So the fact that they were finding themselves happy with this is huge, and this is pause for the travel providers to give themselves a pat on the back for this. The need that customers filed in for with all these customer service calls were really coming in at a huge magnitude, and they dealt with it in a way that made travelers feel satisfied with the experience. But now that the changes have been made for many of the travelers, there's also a massive question about what can change to make them feel comfortable traveling again. We see that many people postponed within the near future, but at the time, the postponement was a bit of a guess, and we wanted to drill down into the specific cues that would make travelers feel more comfortable and more open about hitting the road again and traveling as they used to. What are they looking for to make them feel that they can return to quote unquote business as usual when it comes to their leisure travel? So for starters, let's talk about what is not motivating them. And that is bargains. There have been some very attractive deals that have been put forward from providers during the COVID time with very cheap airfare, hotel rates, etc. that were an option to book during this COVID-19 outbreak. But what travelers are telling us is that the likelihood of taking advantage of those deals is not very high. It's slightly higher overall in the US and France, where 31 to 32% of people expressed high likelihood. But then in the UK and Germany, we're seeing even lower numbers, where fewer than 20% of people in these markets think that they would be very likely to take advantage of deals or bargains that are presented to them during the COVID outbreak. And age does affect this as well. Travelers under 34 overall feel more comfortable than other age groups taking advantage of the COVID leisure travel bargains. Those who are in the oldest age bracket here of 55 plus tend to express much more caution overall. And this is especially pronounced in the UK, where those generations have expressed an abundance of caution. People who are 55 and older in the UK only reported that only 7% of people within this age bracket were highly likely to take advantage of those deals. So there really is a great amount of caution being exercised by people within the older age groups here. What they do want to see is that those barriers we discussed prior, the fear of getting sick or spreading COVID, the fear of restricted mobility, and the fear of not being able to experience and enjoy a destination fully will be lifted. They want to know that they're not going to get sick, they can move, they can experience the way they want to. And this starts first and foremost in most markets with a drop in infection rates. The drop in infection rates is the number one cue that travelers are going to look for in the US, Germany, and France. They want to know that they can go out without getting sick, that they're less likely to be exposed and less likely to spread COVID-19 in general. Now, for the UK, the number one factor that these travelers were looking to know that they could be open traveling again was different. They wanted to see an official government advisory come through. They wanted to see that the government expressed that it was more comfortable increasing travel permissions and that people could feel safer once again. This was still a major consideration for travelers in the US and Germany. In France, we see that this market is a bit of an outlier here. They don't have quite as much trust in the government that the advisory would make a huge difference. They're going to be looking at other factors more so than the official government advisory. Change in quarantine policies would also make people feel more open and free that they can be traveling again without being cooped up in their destination or on their return home. And also a change in border control policies is a frequent factor that people say they would also look to as a cue that traveling again is safe. Now, it's not much of a surprise that the border control policy changes would be more motivating to those who are planning on traveling abroad for their next trip, more so than those who are traveling domestically. But there are definitely domestic travelers who are still looking at the border control policies as a cue that the government feels that mobility can be encouraged again. So everybody would be watching this to some extent across the international travelers or the domestic traveler verticals. And then lastly, the destination experience is something that they want to see expand before they feel comfortable traveling again. First, with hotels, restaurants, and bars reopening, they want to see their lodging abilities or the lodging options expand, and they want to see that they also have increased dining options that are available to them within the destination. It's something that people look forward to. It's something that people rely on when they visit a new place, and they want to know that it's not going to be a challenge with closures to find places to stay and to find places to eat. And then to a lesser extent, the attractions and activity reopenings would also be motivating for people so that they understand that there's plenty for them to do, that they can experience the attractions that characterize a destination, that make a place what it is, and that if they're taking themselves to somewhere new, they're taking themselves to somewhere new to really experience the destination in all of its glory and have the maximal experience that they had really anticipated. Now, These are really factors that may take some time to change. It's a bit of a waiting game to have the public health situation change to an extent where the infection rates are dropping and where the government will lift restrictions and private businesses or private companies will also be free to make the decisions to reopen their businesses and to resume business as usual. The bright spot that we are really seeing is, first of all, that travelers are optimistic. They think this is going to happen relatively soon. They're watching for these things to change in order for them to travel again. And that they still have really positive relationships overall with their providers. While things needed to change, they think that the providers did a very good job with handling the changes that were necessary. So while things are on pause right now, that zeal is still there. That desire to experience the zeitgeist of a place is still there. And travelers are looking for these changes and want to feel that they can be comfortable and open and safe traveling again in the future. Right